Hello and welcome to Executive Sessions. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger. We're being joined by educational leaders from across the United States to break down the topics impacting our industry and our communities during challenging times. I'd like to thank those that helped bring this conversation together. I'd like to thank Strategist Group, developing and influencing through change expertise, and to our friends at EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. I want to get right to it because we've had a lot of off-air conversations here. We've got a great group here on the proverbial panel, the Zoom panel. I want to start off, we've got Dr. Quintin Shepherd. He's the superintendent of the Victoria Independent School District in Texas. Dr. Betsy Hargrove, superintendent of the Avondale Elementary School District in Arizona, where I hear the weather is quite nice. We've got Mark Finstrom. He's CTO with Highline Public Schools in Washington State. Hi, Mark. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Zandra Jo Galvan, superintendent of Greenfield Union School District in Northern California. Welcome, everybody. No doubt is going to sort of jump into this conversation. Look, part of me, I'm riding the fence here as both a parent of two kids in elementary public school, right, and someone who works in the media and education, because it feels like we're at a juncture that we really need to be mindful and very thoughtful of when it comes to educational leadership and the way in which we are engaging our communities, to include our parents, and to think about what we are noticing, what we're not noticing, and maybe what pivots we need to make as schools and districts to meet the needs of our parents and our students and our teachers. Quintin, you had an op-ed recently, and I'm going to share the title with everybody, but it was, "Are You Certain? The Power of Noticing?" So you and I have had conversations from everything from how we're allocating and understanding the spend of our ESSER funds to, where we should be sort of putting our resources in all kinds of domains within education. Talk about the power of noticing in a world where it feels like we are all, in essence, on edge and paying attention in ways that we haven't for generations, especially from the parent side of things.
Absolutely. And thank you for entering the conversation in this way. I think you captured it well. We have more tools at our disposal than we've ever had in the history of humanity. And what that allows us to do is to focus very deeply on anything we want to, not just related to schools, but it could be government or politics or business or what have you. Well, the problem is the more that we focus on a particular element or a particular thing that we want to study, the more that we lose our ability to notice. Right. And I think that it's this juxtaposition that people go through. And so part of what my realization has been as an educational leader, especially in the public sphere, is that while it's important and encouraged that we focus on things like student achievement or focus on things like ESSER funding and how we're going to spend that funding, but it's equally, if not more important, to be a community leader that sometimes begs the question, yeah, but are we noticing this thing here? Like, for instance, ESSER funding, and I'm sure it's something we'll talk about as we get further into the conversation, is I happen to notice what I perceive to be a major equity gap in the way that ESSER funding is being utilized around the country, not just in Texas, but throughout the country in the way that it was structured, just as one example.
Xander, what is your response to that? Look, we talked off air. I mean, you're very sort of public in your declaration of fitness and being a leader in that regard and leading from the front. How do you experience what Quintin is talking about when it comes to how we are noticing what is right in front of us, and how do we either communicate maybe it's the mistakes that we've made or the areas that we need to improve? I feel like there's this notion in education historically that we can't it's like we're returning the rental car at the airport. We can't back up or we're going to pop our tires, right? Can we notice things and say, we thought it was going okay, but gosh, this really has made us pivot. We've noticed something that's different, and it's okay to lead from the front as a superintendent to communicate this, to engage people and bring them in, as opposed to creating sort of these polar opposite positions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, Rod. And I want to echo what my brother there, Q, mentioned about really noticing and also saying, let's lean in as well. So lean in and listen to the conversation that folks are willing to have. And I say willing because leadership has so many different levels, right? There's superintendent to superintendent. How are you feeling? Let's lean in and figure out, are you okay today? Because the weight of the world is on our shoulders. And then I say lean in with leaders within our districts and our organizations to say, how are you doing? How's the family? How are you supported? This is something that is incredibly different than we've ever experienced in our lives before. And in fact, this year starting is even harder than last year starting, because we had systems to set up, which weren't difficult as such because we had already done that. But now we are with kids on campus and the new COVID rising and all those kinds of things. So it's a different year for all of us. And then I say lean in on our parents and our community. As you mentioned, Rod, you're a father first, and then you do all the other stuff you get to do. So how do we lean in with our parents and really listen to the voices of the field and listen to what their reservations are? Some of our parents wanted to send their kids to in person, and some of them wanted to stay on independent study or distance learning because they are so afraid of the unknown. And so I say notice, I say lean in, and then continue to develop relationships with people, because people don't trust you until they know what you're all about and that you are willing to lean in and to listen and to make sure that they're okay. And so that's kind of the platform you shared about, like fit leaders and things like that, and self-care and wellness. In order to lean in and to be our best version of ourselves for others, we have to also take care of ourselves. So as superintendents, we need to take care of ourselves and have that balance, lean in with the family and support from that avenue.
I appreciate the trust component there, Zandra, when you're talking about that. Betsy, help me understand this. So this is not exclusive to sort of my local community, because I've heard this off the record from so many folks, especially from the parent lens. There seems to be a chasm between the district or building level leadership and what is being communicated based on what they're noticing to the parent community. From everything from a parent communication, how are we talking about transportation and pickup, or notifications and sort of off the grid, teachers communicating with parents in ways that maybe haven't been endorsed yet. It's like mixed messaging all over the place. And it feels like we're actually losing trust in a world where, to your point, Zandra, we need more trust to be built so that we can, and Mark, I'm getting ready to chat with you about the technology side, because my goodness, you are front and center in your work as CTO. But Betsy, can you talk a little bit about maybe the internal conversations that either you're having with yourself or even your team about effectively communicating so that you can lean into Zandra's point and build trust, develop trust over time with really the constituency that you need to move things forward in a world where we don't really know what's going to happen tomorrow?
I think actually you are spot on when we think about the complexities of the communication that is absolutely necessary throughout the past 18 months. I think that has been one of the greatest challenges that we've had. I love what you said around, perhaps teachers who are on the front line. I mean, they're our first communicators with our families in that connection that they have, and making sure that the messaging is the same messaging that we are sending from district office. And then the worst part of it is, Rod, is it changes literally. Sometimes we can send a communication out at 1 and by 3 o'clock, completely different, absolutely different. The one thing we say in Avondale, and I think any one of us could say, the only thing consistent about COVID is the inconsistency. And so a couple of things that we've actioned here in Avondale to meet that exact challenge is, before we send anything out to our parents, we send the communication to our staff first. Hey, this is being actioned at 5:30 this afternoon. It's going out to parents. We want you to know what is going out prior to, in case as at dismissals, you have an opportunity, you're not caught off guard, you understand what the communication is and what our next steps are. So that was one of the pieces that we put into place that, I'll be honest, that was a miss on my part. And we had teachers reach out and say, hey, I was asked this question, I didn't know how to answer it. Could we have that information beforehand? Absolutely. Easy fix. The other piece is, and I think we all know this as leaders, when there's lack of information gets made up, right? It's a human nature. If I don't know the information, I'm going to start guessing at it. I'm going to start making assumptions. And we want to minimize that as best as possible. And we have a very active parent group on Nextdoor or on Facebook, et cetera. And rather than trying to do a holistic outreach, we want everyone to have the information. Literally, we did Zoom invites to that Nextdoor parent group and to that Facebook and said, hey, send this out to anyone that you want to. And we're going to have a webinar on Friday, and here's the information. Let's get on together so we have all of the information. And then literally from that group, put together a voiced over PowerPoint so that everyone had it. Now that's available for everyone. Those are just two examples of how we've tried to navigate that world of the unknown. And if nothing else, say, we may not have all the answers, but you will have the answers we have. And as things change, we'll make sure that you get that new information.
See, what I appreciate about that, Betsy, is that, sorry, real quick, Quinton, is running parallel with the parents, right? You're admitting, look, we made some mistakes here and there, but you're running parallel. I think that is such a key component to recognizing the environment that you're in and offering participation by those that might have concerns, questions. Quinton?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you can see why I think so highly of my colleagues here, but the layer I would add to what she just said that's so vital, the words that she used that I want to reemphasize so much, is that noting the difference between complex and complicated. Complex is inherently unknowable. Complicated has a right answer. There's a way to do it. And so we've somehow fooled ourselves into believing that every problem that we face in the public sphere is complicated, and it's not. Like, there are some things that are inherently unknowable. And what you heard Betsy talk so eloquently about is this notion of how do you build ownership around the complex? You go to your community first. You have that conversation with your community. You don't say to your community, oh, we're the smartest people in the education space right now. We know the best way to educate kids during a pandemic. The truth is, we don't. So we're going to go to our community. It's complex. It's unknowable. And let's try to figure out the problem together. And then I'm going to tie that back into what Zandra said just a few minutes ago. It's all about vulnerability. Like, how do we teach leaders? How do we encourage leaders to be vulnerable in the public space in such a way that we can build ownership around the complex, like Betsy's talking about? And that's where the magic happens. But too many people just aren't doing it in this day and age. And that I think is the great frustration so many parents feel.
Yeah, and being able to pivot in that. Mark, I want to pull you into this conversation. So I'm going to take you back, let's say 3 years, and I'm having an internal meeting with my district. Because like I said, I can't not help bring the dad part of me in. And I'm having to have a conversation with the head of curriculum about some other components. And because I interface with technology companies and CTOs, like I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what districts are using, what they like, what they don't, challenges. And parent communication came up and the way in which we are documenting learning, right? So this gets to this trust component where technology was such a nice to have pre-COVID, and then it became, oh my goodness, this is a life raft. We've got to really figure this application out, or the collection of applications. And in that conversation, Mark, I'll never forget, this individual said to me, when I said, well, how are you preparing to communicate learning to families? And they said, well, we're not doing that with technology. We're never going to do that. And I said, well, what's interesting about that one is that I don't think that that's going to be the case. You talk about not building trust. I said, you have a wave of parents around this country that are in pre-K situations through franchises where they have apps. They know everything that's going on for that child during the day. And I said, I think you're going to have a generation of parents that are going to have that expectation in public schools, that we have some interface to know what's going on with my child. And so that I can develop a better relationship with my child's teacher or their teachers. And I just say that as sort of a preamble, Mark, to say, what has it been like for you over the last 18 months when you think about sort of not just being maybe what someone might say is the gatekeeper, but sort of the keeper, right? You're sort of the shepherd, keeping all of these applications together and making decisions that support your district in a really thoughtful manner. Has that been more challenging than you could have ever imagined? And what lessons can we take from a superintendent position from your seat as a CTO?
Well, I think it's a lot of it is partnerships. So Dr. Susan Enfield is my superintendent, strong person. She's got a very good pulse on the community. And I'm talking just the community where we live, but your community, all of you as superintendents. And one of the things that she was very clear to me about, not a single child was left behind. Our motto, our promise is know every student by name, strengthen them, need, and prepare them for the future that they choose. And that has been at the forefront of our discussions, our decisions, all of our work for the last 4 or 5 years. And, I had 52% of my community did not have internet connectivity 18 months ago. So I deployed a little over 5,000 hotspots, and that worked to some degree, but I also worked with Comcast, and I provide internet essentials basically to as many as I could. Well, that's great. I also needed to provide devices. So we went from basically being one-to-one to being one-to-one in 2 days. We deployed 13,000 devices to students who didn't have one at home 2 days after we shut down. So, all my staff were busy at schools, and they just came through in a parade and picked up devices. The next thing was, and Quintin mentioned this, tools. Tools are like so prevalent, but a lot of them don't meet our privacy requirements. A lot of them don't meet our requirements for COPPA. And so we engaged in, we were already using a tool called Learn Platform, but we engaged with Learn Platform to be a little bit more dedicated to look at tools. We've reviewed 324 different applications that teachers wanted to use, and only 45 of those have been approved and or supported by the district level. Now, there are others that are approved, but just not supported by us. So they can't have any integration with other systems. So it's lost data, right? And that lost data comes back to you as superintendents to say, was there actually any growth with that tool? Whereas the 45 that I use, I actually can route those through our dashboard, and I can say, we use Edgenuity, and our percentage of growth is X percent by grade, by subject area, et cetera. And I can go through that, and I can make sure that it's successful. But we had to eliminate tools in order to be effective. You cannot support 324 tools to parents. Parents were screaming at us because we had 7 tools that were communicating. We were using our student information system to communicate them. We were using Thought Exchange to communicate with them. We were using Remind. We were using School Messenger. We were using our website. And quite honestly, the barrage of communication that came from us to the parents was enough to drive the parents crazy. And the parents just said, stop, time out. Can you synchronize this in a way that works? Which is what we've been doing for the last 18 months, is whittling down the tools to make sure that the right tool is used for the right topic, and that we communicate to our staff, like Betsy said, first, before you communicate to the community, so that the staff, if they get a call, can't say, I didn't know, you didn't tell me.
Because at the other end of that is a confused parent who didn't get the same information that the neighbor got.
Exactly.
So, Zandra, what has the relationship with your district been when you think about technology? Because I think, Mark, I love, sort of this discussion of sort of having to whittle things down, and also the relationship and communication with parents as you're doing that. How has the relationship with technology changed in your internal discussions? Because from the parent's perspective, I can say that it is maddening to what Mark is talking about, because you just never know where things are coming and at what sort of importance level you're receiving it at.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take a step into that direction, but I'm going to take a step back for a minute and just talk about big picture when it came to moving into the tech direction and moving into the responding to COVID. And so in Greenfield, what we did immediately once the pandemic hit is we created a reopening task force. And the task force was comprised of 70 individuals. And that was a cross section of parents, community members, administrators, labor partners, so teachers union leaders, as well as our classified bargaining units. And so we all just came together with a common purpose and say, okay, what are some defining areas that we need support in? And then how do we respond? What are the needs? And so it was a cross section of stakeholders that had representatives that they were, coming to the table representing teachers. And we had a ton of teachers on the committee, people representing nutrition, transportation, our tech force. And then we had like the family liaison engagement type of team, so that they were thoughtful about what we were going to do. How was this going to be released to parents? How are we going to make sure we were training them? Because what Mark mentioned about devices, yes, we were able to rally quickly to deploy devices and hotspots, But that doesn't matter unless you know how to use the tool, right? And so the parent component was so critical. And I come from a community of 95% of our population are Spanish speakers. And so you also need to realize, how do we communicate in a language that is going to respond to their needs and they understand that? And then I have another population within our community from in Mexico, from the state of Oaxaca, that does not speak Spanish or English. They speak indigenous languages. So on top of that, you're trying to figure, okay, so how do I get a translator to translate for the translator to get the communication so that they know how to use the device, right? So all these kinds of things we quickly deployed, but we identified what were the areas that we needed to focus on through that task force. So we had six dimensions. We had the family, we had the instructional dimension, the safety, the health, guidelines as well, the family engagement component, and then we had nutrition. So we had those 6 dimensions, and they each had a subcommittee within it. So with instruction, going back to the question that you asked of Mark, was the technology, what was necessary? And so we looked at the safety lens. Okay, so how are we going to make sure that we get the devices out there quickly and we have care for them, and that they're, if they're coming back to school, they're staying safe? How do we keep the family component? So what kinds of lessons could we design for our parent community through Zoom, because we couldn't have them on our campuses, that we could do tutorials through YouTube, tutorials through a Zoom platform for our parents to come and meet with us? And then instructionally, how are we going to use the devices to meet the needs of our kiddos? And then I'm going to lean back to what Mark said about, with our ESSER dollars, we can buy a bunch of stuff, but is in the long term, is it a return on our investment? So we too bought the farm. And this year we said, okay, maybe we're only going to focus on this ranch and this ranch and this ranch, because we didn't need the entire buffet, but we had to buy the buffet with our dollars to figure out what tastes the best. And now we're in a place where we are still using our devices. Kids are still logging into Google Classroom. They're still doing a lot of the wonderful platforms that we learned were powerful. And those have remained to stay true this year. Did we abandon some? Sure, because we didn't use them to the level that we thought we were going to use them. So that was a lot, but
no, I appreciate it.
Can I ask a follow-up? Is that okay? So Zandra, I have this theory about new technologies. People adopt new technology, not just education, across any space. They only adopt new technology for one of 3 reasons. It's either entertainment, it's social, or it's survival. Right? So like TV, it's entertainment. You adopt the technology, right? Telephone, social. You adopt the new technology. Survival. Okay? Things like email. That became a survival tool. If you can't do email, you're not employable, right? Zoom, as an example. Here's my question for you. I think we can safely say that technology in the education space is not entertainment. It's not really social, but it almost walked up to the line of being survival. Like, you had to have this technology in order to survive in the environment that was the pandemic. Do you think that will still hold true coming out of the pandemic, or will there be school districts that revert back and say, no, we were fine with the way things were before? This is something I struggle with a lot. I'd be curious how you frame it.
So I think it's an essential now, in terms of, in order to survive, in order to access education, it's an essential. And so I see the technology as here to stay. In my district, we are absolutely still integrating. Kids have the Chromebook devices at their workstation. And whenever they're creating a presentation, they're logging in. When they're sharing things, they're logging in, they're doing things like that. Whereas in the past, and this is going to happen because we have a gambit of teachers on our teaching force. But I must say this, my teachers were phenomenal. And I'm sure yours were too, in quickly learning how to Zoom. We didn't even know. In fact, I'm going to tell you a funny story real fast. We did a parent town hall meeting with a whole bunch of parents. My team was Zooming, and deploying the host rights so we could all share. Well, they gave the actual host rights to one of my parents who had logged in with his phone and ended the meeting in an instance, right? So we have learned so much, and we had to get hundreds of parents back on the Zoom call right after that happened. But going back to your question with the essential, we absolutely know there's going to be a whole level of teachers that were those teachers that they drank the Kool-Aid really quick and they said, I got this. Tech's always been my dream. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. Welcome to the team, right? And then you had the ones like, oh, yeah, how do you check my email again? And so what we did is we brought them all together, and our continued message is, when we know better, we do better, right? Maya Angelou, when we know better, we do better. And so now that we know, our kids are way ahead of the game. Like, they didn't need us to teach them tech skills. They are teaching us the tech skills. And so it's here to stay. In every one of my classrooms, we still have the one-to-one devices. They take them home, they bring them back. They take them home, they bring them back for their studies. We are not sending them home with textbooks anymore. That's gone. We're not sending them home with packets of material to complete and regurgitate information. They are now telling their story on a laptop. They're explaining by taping and video recording their response so the teacher can then hear it. So that's the new normal. Now, is everyone there 100% in the United States? I don't think so, right? But it's a journey for us to get to a place where we feel confident and comfortable to lead in that direction, because the amounts of the kids that we're going to be producing are nowhere near us, right? We sat in rows every day, and just we had a sage on stage telling us how to learn. We listened, we filled our little brain with their knowledge, and we went off to the next grade. That should be a thing of the past. We should be collaborating, being creative, and all those kinds. And one more thing I'll tell you, in my very first year as a superintendent, I got rid of all the desks. They were gone. There are tables in every one of my classrooms sitting in collaborative seats. And I will tell you, it was a kind of a tough little deal now that pandemic hit, and they were like, oh, shoot, now we got to have 6 feet of separation. There went my collaborative, creative, communicative kind of thing. But I said, this is temporary, people. This is temporary. The pandemic will pass. We still need creative, collaborative communicators that can critically think on their own when we send them off to the post-secondary world.
Zandra, thank you for that. You mentioned the task force, which is, I think we could dive into that for a whole nother discussion, but just to even have 70 people that were a part of that is very, very impressive. Betsy, one thing that I want to make sure that we touch on, that I'm concerned that when the dust settles, that it's either going to be an afterthought, or we're going to sort of try to rapidly make amends to get something back on track, which is SEL, social emotional learning, and sort of the impact, not just on our students, but on the relationship they have with their teachers, right? And this just the whole experience, because it felt like everything was about plugging holes, right? The dam was breaking. We just had to get through. We had to get through. And I'm wondering, I hear some chatter of it, is that there's residual of that even going into this school year. And how can we look at and think maybe differently about social emotional learning and use the things that we have maybe at our disposal? Maybe it's technology. Maybe it's different ways in which to think about that relationship that teachers have with students, because boy, it's front and center now. I don't think parents thought about that relationship their child had with their teacher like they do now, and the importance of that. How have you approached that, especially with elementary age students?
Okay, so you must have seen my face when Quinton said, okay, technology, does that, and having the device, does that go into the social side of things? And I'm sure, because if you want to win some money, we could play poker. You would win. I have no poker face. I'm sure technology is social. I'm 100% positive. And if we didn't know it from our kids before now, we definitively know it, because during this pandemic, it was their avenue to be able to connect with one another, to see one another, to physically see people's responses. My response to that wonderment that Q had a few minutes ago, because I really truly believe, while there's nothing, absolutely nothing that is going to beat a face-to-face opportunity and being in the same space to be able to actually see someone's entire physical response to things. However, this is as close as we could get in these set of circumstances. So when you talk about those relationships between our teachers and our students, I'm going to yes, because not only last year was it between our teachers and our students, it was between our teachers, our students, and their siblings, and their guardians, and their caregivers, and their parents. And when we say, the conversation in Avondale is, who's at your table? Who are you welcoming to your table? Well, quite frankly, our families welcomed us to their kitchen table, to their living rooms, to their family rooms, to every spot in their home, because that's where we were living in order to be able to have our children learn and grow in these very unique set of circumstances. And so the question now around SEL and what do we do? Is technology a piece of it? I will say definitively, when we think about healthcare and where that has gone, when we think about mental and behavioral supports for children and adults, and I can't emphasize that enough, and adults, because our adults are definitely finding and needing opportunities to be able to be supported differently than what they have ever had in the past. But so often, now I'm having a Zoom conversation with my healthcare provider, and we have close relationships with telehealth people who are doing counseling and behavioral and mental health support via Zoom or via some sort of a technology face-to-face as opposed to an in-person. And quite frankly, actually, I think while again, I'm a need an E person, and you would prefer certainly being in person with someone. Barring that, having the accessibility and the availability and the removal of barriers up to and including possibly transportation and being able to get there or time away from work. I live 50 miles from where I work. If my child has a doctor's appointment, I can actually be there. I can be on my daughter's phone. And I can be in communication with her doctor while my 18-year-old, of course, with permission from her, to be able to sit there and have that conversation with them through technology. That same thing can happen. I can actually have more access to supporting my children and finding supports for myself than ever before. And if we go back to only saying I have to drive 50 miles in order to be there, I'm going to say we're missing something. And
if we have to use technology in a certain way, like we did pre-pandemic, we're missing it, right? It's not linear in approach at all, right? This is that comprehensive, complexities are complicated, right, to that piece. Mark, based on what Betsy's talking about, are you gathering different types of requests from your teachers or the sort of the community at large when it comes to, wow, I have a different understanding of technology, that it can be social, right? Are we talking about more of a social learning community, and then sort of the request or the way in which they're looking at the technology that is being dispersed from the district level down to the schools?
Yeah, well, it's definitely social. There's no doubt about it. We've been doing SEL work for probably 5 or 6 years, and we've tried to integrate everything that we can into there to make sure that, one, it's appropriate, two, that it's used effectively. That's, Zandra brought that up, and Betsy brought it up. You can't just throw technology out there and expect it to be used. And if you want a result, you have to model that result. So we do our best to model, social emotional learning through the tools that we use. And we do our best to make sure that the tools are, I'm going to say, gardened. They're put into a garden that protects students as much as possible. But then the other side of it is, I use tools that actually search against what students are searching and go against the files that they're creating. It pulls back, self-harm. It pulls back suicidal ideations. It pulls back all that kind of information, which is the other side of the social, right? If a student is doing well, they're well adjusted. But if they're struggling, they're really struggling right now. And so the tools that I use give me the opportunity to engage the counselors with the families, and I would say save lives.
To be plugged in. Quinton, I want to turn to you. And in my short time in knowing you, I think that you can't be anything but honest, which I'm sure your friends and colleagues really appreciate about you. How do we avoid going backwards, right? How can we be more progressive when we think about education? Because even for all of us that love it and have worked in it and committed sort of blood, sweat, and tears to it, there's that challenge of, can we not be just the institution that is slow moving, that lacks sort of innovation or creativity, right? That can say, wait a minute, we're doing this in our private lives and our social lives. Why can't we apply that to a learning environment? Are we asking the right questions as leaders in education? And what do we need to be doing and convening conversations like this that can help to propel a different and hopefully progressive conversation forward that people can learn from?
I want to frame up kind of what the other folks said leading into this, and then answer the question at the same time. I think to clarify a little bit, we do use technology for social. I do, my kids do, all of us do. But when it comes to like, do we need technology for education? Like, is education, is that the critical need? Is that the survival piece to why? Like, here's the basic question. Did a kid adopt Schoology as a survival mechanism to get their education? No. ClassLink? No. Like, they adopted these technologies so they can communicate with their friends and watch YouTube videos. So like, that's the entertainment and social bit, but we didn't capitalize on that in education. We didn't make it a critical, like, you have to be able to use tech. Why is that? Well, if you think about education, the way that we all got education, it basically boils down to a two-part formula. And Zandra kind of alluded to this. Like, concentration of information, I'm the teacher, distribution of knowledge, you're the student. That's it. That was the totality of education, regardless of the subject or what grade level. Technology gives us the opportunity to think differently. Like, the knowledge isn't always in Quintin's head. It actually might exist better, like, online, and you could find it online. So the next iteration for technology and education, as certain as I'm sitting here, you are seeing industries become more and more concentrated in where the knowledge lives. And there's folks in the education space that are making this happen. And I think that's step number one in making real change in education, like ground sweeping change into how we do it. The people who will be the next turn, the folks who will really bring this home for us, they're going to control the distribution. Nobody is in that space right now. And that's what effective teachers and effective school districts should be focusing on 100%. Like, forget this notion that the teacher has to be the expert, but let's focus on distribution networks. Like, how can we figure out how to distribute knowledge to kids in a way that they want to receive it, whether it's YouTube videos or online or these videos, so on and so forth. So what is it about the innovation piece, to get to your question, that gets in our way? What gets in our way more than anything else when it comes to innovation is two things. I'm convinced it's just two things. People are not afraid of failure. That is not true at all, and anybody who says it is dead wrong. People are not afraid of failure. They are afraid of blame. And in our culture in the United States, failure is often equated to blame, right? And people don't want to be blamed. And so we have to develop cultures that are not connecting failure to blame. We have to embrace failure. We have to celebrate failure. We have to seek out failure. And here's the reason why. Here's why failure is so important to innovation. Because the real purpose of innovation is to reduce the cost of failure so that you can increase the value. That's innovation. Like, lots of the stuff that we try is going to fail. We're going to try some technology. We're going to try some tool. We're going to try some instructional technique. And it fails. The trick is do it in small doses. Do it in lots of different ways that you try stuff out, right? You're doing micro tests. Reduce the cost of failure so that you can increase the value. Hey, we tried this thing. It didn't work. Let's try this next thing. That's the heart of innovation. And we don't have that in the education space. And the reason why? It's back to blame. If the school report card says, oh, my child's in a failing school, is that school ever going to innovate? No, because we've adopted such a judgment-based culture in education. We judge everything. We give kids grades, we give teachers grades, we give schools grades, we give superintendents grades, we have financial grades. Everything I do from the minute I walk in my office till the minute I leave is a judgment-based culture. And we basically have done this to ourselves over the last 40 years in education, starting with A Nation at Risk and virtually everything we've done moving forward. But that judgment culture is actually now working against us. So what we have to do is we have to, and my colleagues on the phone, they speak to this so well. We have to embrace a compassionate culture. And a compassionate culture is like suffer. That's it. Passion means suffer. Compassion is to suffer with. So as a superintendent, when I stand up and I share my suffering with my community, like, I don't have the technology tools that I'd like to have available for my kids during the pandemic. And I haven't gotten the ESSER funds, so I don't know how to provide those. That's a conversation where the community steps up and says, oh yeah, we're going to help you solve this problem. We're going to take ownership of this and move it forward. And I think that's how a community embraces innovation as well, is if as a compassionate leader, you say, I actually don't know. I don't know the right thing to do at this moment in time. What do you think?
Betsy, I saw you nod a few times. You had reactions to Quintin.
A tremendous number of things that he was saying completely resonated with me, and I think with this entire group, in the sense of we've readily talked. Zandra, you talked about bringing entire communities together, 70 people together to say, how are we going to do this? Which is very different from we're going to do this, right? And we don't have the answer to this incredibly complex set of circumstances that we are in the only possible way that we are going to be able to get through this together is to get through it together. One thing we've talked about in Avondale is I used to say, oh, we're all in the same boat, guys. We're all in the same boat. It hit me pretty early on of we are not at all in the same boat. As a matter of fact, we're in the same storm. There's no doubt about that. But we are all in very different vessels, and we all have very different sets of experiences and competencies and opportunities that have brought us here. And so because of that, we have to approach this. I love what you just said, Quinton, with compassion, with vulnerability, with the ability to say, unlike really where we've been in the past, everyone says, looks at the leader and says, what are we going to do? We don't know, because we have never been here before. And we would be remiss if we did not look at this as an incredible opportunity to be able to come together and do things very differently from what we did in the past. And I happened to see, it was just a headline and a picture of a school going back, a school district going back to school next week. And it was, I will tell you what struck me is the classroom looked identical to what it did 2 years ago. And I thought, let's hope that's an archived picture. That's actually what I thought, because it needs to look different. We need to engage differently, and we need to not step away from the collateral benefits that we have seen come through these uncharted waters that we've been in, and how do we then take that next step forward and be a part of that next generation of how our children are going to grow and learn, because they are going to be the people who are going to be leading in this, and they need to be able to see that and see that example with compassion and with understanding, with vulnerability. This is complex, and we're going to walk through this together.
And I would, please, Zandra, go ahead.
I wanted to put an exclamation mark on a couple of those points. And so leaning back into the complex versus complicated, I think that's a really great point that Quinton made in terms of, yes, it can be solved. And it's through that leadership mentality of really getting people together that you can really grapple through and figure those things out. That's really important. And also noticing, the other exclamation mark is what my friend here, Betsy, just said, is about, yes, we're all in the same storm, but we're all in different boats. And that was clear. And this is going to emphasize what Mark was mentioning too. Some of us are in really nice yachts. Some of us are in paddle boats. Some of us have a boat with a lot of holes on the bottom of the boat. And so we all come from different perspectives and different tools in our tool belt, and we need our educational system to provide those tools. We need, like, a lot of things need to just be a public utility, like the internet and the Wi-Fi. Like, that was a huge roadblock for us. And so things like that, I wanted to put an exclamation mark on those, because yes, we're in a pickle. There's some serious things happening to us all over the nation and the world for that matter, but it isn't without being able to solve it. We absolutely can solve it when you get people together in that room. And I will tell you, I threw the problem out in the middle of the table, and I'm okay with that kind of leadership. I don't have to be the smartest person. I have a title, but that title bestowed upon me is only as good as the trust that I build with my people, right? And so here's the situation, guys. How do we get through it? And then I'll bring in all of the mandates and all of the requirements and all of the, the state level laws that we have to abide by. And I'll give you that lens. But there's so many different ways to solve a situation. And I'll tell you, with working with our labor partners, that has earned me tremendous amount of respect, because there was so many different ways for us to solve the situation. The state of California said we need you to have a minimum of 3.5 hours of instruction. And so we immediately we went back to the Rose and previous American system and saying this is the way it was going to be, but it didn't have to be like that. So we had 3 different models that people could choose from. And our parents were fine with that. Our staff was fine with that in our community.
Well, I can say this, we could definitely have a conversation that would last the 3.5 hours for sure. But I know that the community supports that you all have things to do in the community. And I just want to say this, that I think it's also about not just convening conversations, but reintroducing the American community to those that are leading and making decisions that impact our kids. And if we've done anything here today, I hope we've sparked conversation, that we've learned a thing or two from what each of us are doing in the industry. and really to hope to support connection beyond this conversation. So I want to thank Dr. Quintin Shepherd, Superintendent of Victoria Independent School District in Texas, Dr. Betsy Hargrove, Superintendent of the Avondale Elementary School District in Arizona, Mark Finstrom, CTO with Highline Public Schools in Washington, and Dr. Zandra Jo Galvan, Superintendent of Greenfield Union School District, and our partners, Strategos Group and EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger. I look forward to the next conversation, and folks, keep doing all that you're doing. We really do appreciate it as citizens of this great country. Thank you so much.